Welcome back to another edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. My name is Andy Barch, and I am joined alongside Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and, of course, BrownsZone.com. Scott actually joins us today out in Berea because this is the last week of the season. Browns getting ready for the Cincinnati Bengals on Sunday. Scott, how are you? Merry Christmas to you and yours, and how are things in Berea?
I'm good, Andy. Yeah, same to you. Merry Christmas. Things are okay in Berea. We weren't out here on Christmas. I think the players had an abbreviated day. So then today is a bit of a longer day to play catch-up. But, it's a weird vibe. It always is. We've been through this when there's no playoffs to play for the final week. Uncertainty about the coach. It just feels different. We just talked to the coordinators. It's the last time we're going to talk to him this year, and you wonder if it's the last time you're going to talk to him in this role, with them in these roles for the Browns. So the next, whatever it is, 4 or 5 days, they're going to be interesting.
Yes, they will be very interesting indeed. And coming up here in just a bit, I want to dive into some of the things that you heard from the coordinators. But before we get into that, we do need to address what happened on Sunday, where the Browns lost a game where, at the beginning of it, they were certainly in, but they lost to a team that is on an absolute roll right now. Scott, we'll begin with your three major takeaways from the Browns' loss this past Sunday to the Ravens.
Yeah, the first two are tied in with each other, and I think we'll expand on them as we go here. But the end of the first half, the Browns were up 6-0. Not that they were in control, but they were where they needed to be. If they were going to upset the Ravens, it felt like they had to play that kind of a game. And the way it was going, maybe they can win a game 17-13, something like that. So they're up 6-0, and then Freddie Kitchens makes, in my opinion, a series of awful play calling / clock management decisions. The defense has a couple breakdowns, and all of a sudden they're down 14-0 at the end of the half. And then that all happened in the last 2:09. So that's where the game changed. And that leads into my second takeaway is, could that be the final nail in the coffin for Freddie Kitchens? I don't know that. I don't know for sure that he'll be fired. I think the decision it might still be being made, and maybe it won't even be made until after the finale Sunday in Cincinnati. But if you're the Haslams, and you're John Dorsey and Paul DePodesta, and you're watching that game, and you're on the fence, so you have doubts about Freddie, in my thought, he did not help himself with how he handled the end of that first half. And then the last takeaway, you mentioned the Red Hot Ravens, and obviously they are, right? They haven't lost since the Browns beat them in Week 4. And I think one of the keys to being that kind of team, to being a Super Bowl favorite, is when things aren't going your way, you still figure it out. And I thought that was obvious with Lamar Jackson. Right? He's going to be the MVP of the NFL. I think most of us can agree with that. He's a huge betting favorite to win the MVP. And he was having a little bit of a rough half. He had a fumble. He missed an open guy on 4th down. And then the Browns give him a chance at the end of the half. And he goes 3 straight drives with 3 straight touchdown passes, and it's game over. So, when you look at how teams have that kind of success and teams that go to the playoffs and have a chance to go to the Super Bowl, they get those types of performances, especially from the quarterback. And I thought on a shaky day to start, Lamar still played like an MVP.
I think it's awfully difficult to dispute that. And I think what's frustrating for Browns fans is that, as you mentioned, Scott, this looked like, at least at the beginning of the game, a contest where the Browns had an opportunity to pull off an upset, and that sure looked like on the surface it was going to at least kind of revitalize these guys a little bit, because a lot of things were going to happen over the last 2 weeks of the season for them to get into the playoffs. But a win like that would have been a huge boost to confidence, and I think with this team, you just kind of expect the worst to happen. It's just been one of those seasons.
Well, yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the playoffs, because actually everything else that needed to happen happened. Pittsburgh loses, Tennessee loses, Indianapolis wins. If the Browns had won, they would have gone into Week 17 with the chance to kind of get in the back door of the playoffs. And I know that there'd be a different vibe in Berea. There'd be a different vibe among the fans, trying to figure out if they could get into the playoffs at 8-8 and end this, what now has become a 17-year playoff drought. So, yeah, so they did have that chance, and that's what makes it more frustrating is not only did they have the chance against Baltimore on Sunday, they had the chance against Pittsburgh on December 1st and against Arizona the week before, and they couldn't win any of those games. And I think you can obviously argue the Pittsburgh and Arizona games were certainly winnable, more so maybe than Baltimore, just given the opponent. But they had the chances to control, the playoff destiny, even after going 2-6, and they still couldn't get it done. So that is frustrating. I think if you beat Baltimore, that gives you one more thing to hang your hat on. Number one, if you're Coach Freddie Kitchens, you sweep Baltimore, you can point to two great wins that look good on your resume when you're selling yourself, if you need to sell yourself to the ownership and John Dorsey and whoever. And then, just from an organizational standpoint, you'd have been 4-1 in the AFC North with the chance to go 5-1 Sunday in Cincinnati. It's another good win. Like if you talk about a team going from the dregs of the NFL, which they were, to getting to where they want to go, it's these kinds of steps, these kinds of foundational moments. And, yeah, I think they had a chance to have another one against the Ravens on Sunday at home finale, and they couldn't get it done. And not only could they not get it done, the way they let it get away is, I don't know the perfect word for it, frustrating, disappointing, exasperating, because they had a chance to get into halftime with the lead, and, in my opinion, just gave that chance away with 2, 3, 4 terrible decisions by Freddie Kitchens.
And the head coaching discussion, I'm sure, is something we'll have an opportunity to dive into, if not today, certainly in future episodes as well, because that will dominate the offseason for sure, one way or the other, regardless of what the Haslams decide to do. It'll be something that gets talked about extensively. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this time of the week is the fact that you get the opportunity, Scott, to hear from the coordinators. You mentioned at the very beginning of today's show that, you don't know if this is going to be the last time that you get the chance to talk to these coordinators as members of the Browns. But, based on what you heard from the coordinators today, were there anything that they said that really kind of stood out to you and made you say, wow, okay, that's at least a little bit surprising?
I don't know about that. I do think my biggest takeaway from the coordinators was Steve Wilks, the defensive coordinator, he's been where Freddie Kitchens is right now a year ago. He was a first-time head coach in Arizona. It was his first season. And they go 3-13, and the speculation starts about his job. And he starts getting asked questions about job security, he said, with 5 or 6 weeks left in the season. So he can relate to exactly what Freddie Kitchens is going through. And I don't know how much comfort Freddie Kitchens can take in that, but I would think it might be nice to have that sounding board, a guy that, you can maybe talk to about it, and he can be a sounding board for you. Not crying on his shoulder, but you know what I mean? You can talk to him, but, hey, how'd you handle this? How do you get through it? Because it's a tough thing personally. And I'm not saying Freddie's going to get fired, but Steve Wilks can relate to just the speculation. And he talked about it. And he thinks Freddie is the right man for the job. And he thinks that, he said it takes time to build a culture, to get everyone on the same page. And I do think that's something that maybe we overlook when we talk about, fire a coach after 1 year. We can point to things like the clock management at the end of that first half against the Ravens. You can point to wearing the T-shirt before that Pittsburgh rematch. Like, there are these moments where you go, man, he didn't handle it like I would want my head coach to handle. But if you go big picture, it does take time to establish things, right? And you have your own system and your own style and get everybody on board. So I think Steve Wilks makes a good point. Obviously he's a biased observer. He wants to come back next year. It's his boss, all those things. But I do think the perspective is valuable because he was here in the same spot, just 12 months ago.
Yes, I think having that commonality, that definitely helps. You mentioned that the sounding board, or at least somebody Freddie Kitchens can share something with. The fact there's all this speculation about whether he will or he won't be here next year. And, well, look, one of the things I think that drives Browns fans nuts is the fact that when they watch games this year, it really doesn't seem as though Freddie can be a head coach and call plays at the same time, because there are so many scenarios that you could point to where things just didn't work. Maybe he's got too much on his plate. And, about an hour or so ago, just kind of following through your Twitter feed, Todd Monken said there's been no discussion of him calling plays for the finale. Not that we expected wholesale changes for the last game, but you like to think that in a game that doesn't mean a whole lot in the grand scheme of things at this point, that if there was going to be an opportunity where they gave Monken a little bit longer of a leash, this would be the scenario, no?
That's an interesting thought. I get your point, and I do think there's some validity there that does it really matter, and let's see what he could do. I just think if you're Freddie Kitchens, you don't want to open that door, right? You've called plays all year. For whatever reason, you don't want Monken to come in and light it up, as a play caller, and then, man, why didn't you make this move earlier? So I think it's unrealistic to think that would happen, but I understand that if you're not Freddie Kitchens, it's not the worst idea in the world, right, to see what Todd Monken can do, although he's been a play caller throughout his career. So I think people know what he can do, and I think that's one of the frustrating things for fans and maybe even inside the building is that you have, in my mind, a proven play caller in Todd Monken. He's got more experience calling plays than Freddie Kitchens. Freddie Kitchens had only called plays for the final 8 games last year. And that play caller in Todd Monken is up in the booth, not calling plays. Now he has a role in the game plan, and, I know he talks to Freddie throughout the game, but it's different. It's different having, so to speak, the ball in your hands like Freddie Kitchens does. I'll say this, and I do want to just get into a little bit of specifics about the end of that first half in a minute, but if Freddie Kitchens is retained, I think it's certainly on the table and would almost be expected for him to give up the play-calling duties. I just think he hasn't been good enough in that role. You talked about being able to handle the dual role, and he's obviously struggled handling both, right? The overall CEO job on the sidelines as well as calling the offensive plays at the same time. So I think the season's been bad enough, and they've failed to meet expectations, obviously, that there would have to be significant changes, and one of those could be Freddie Kitchens turning over the play-calling duties, even if it's hard for him to do. I think that's something he might have to do. And, I think the last 209 against Baltimore just drove home that point. He's got 3rd and 1 at his own 28. And they're up 6-0, like I said. Baltimore's out of timeouts. They used 2 timeouts, and then they lost the challenge. If you hand the ball to Nick Chubb and get a yard, you can almost guarantee you go into halftime up 6-0, which is huge, right? You're halfway to an upset. You have all the momentum in the world. And instead, Freddie Kitchens calls a halfback option that, I went back and watched it a bunch of times. Like, it looked like there's no way it could possibly work. There was one guy that ran a route, Ricky Seals-Jones, and he was double covered. Odell Beckham Jr. just turned around kind of like as an outlet, and the guy was right on top of him. They didn't block anybody, so Hunt luckily got hit before he could even try to throw the ball. It was just a bizarre time to call the play, and I don't think it was a well-designed play. It certainly wasn't well executed. And then to compound that, Freddie says, well, if he'd thrown incomplete, I was going to go for it on 4th down from his 28-yard line. Up 6-0. Makes no sense either. And then that's bad enough. They punt. Baltimore scores in 2 plays, defensive breakdown, blown coverage. So now you're down 7-6. You get the ball back with 1:18. Just go into halftime. Down 7-6. The game's still there for you. And Freddie throws the ball 3 straight times. No timeouts for Baltimore. If he runs it once, Baltimore gets the ball with like 20 seconds left. Instead, throws it 3 times, punt, Baltimore has 55 seconds, and goes down and scores another touchdown. Now, yeah, the defense, you need the defense to step up. But to me, Freddie Kitchens started the whole unraveling. And, that's where the game was lost. And like I talked about earlier, when you're making this list of reasons to keep or fire Freddie Kitchens, that certainly goes on the list of why to fire him.
And while we're on that topic, because I think that Baltimore scenario, regardless of what happens in the offseason, will be the one that people circle, highlight, and underline, because as you stated earlier, if they had won this, everything else kind of fell into place for the Browns to stay alive in the playoff picture. But that scenario, that momentum that was given to Baltimore in the final few minutes of the first half seemed to squash any momentum the Browns had with a chance of getting an upset against a team that on paper they didn't have much business beating the second time around. But it seems to me, Scott, that if that wasn't the final straw that broke the camel's back as far as retaining him as a head coach, it seems like that may have been enough for the Haslams and John Dorsey to say, okay, you know what? We're going to keep you around, but it feels like there's too much on your plate. And maybe it wasn't just that scenario in Baltimore, but I think that may have been the last thing they needed to see before saying, we're going to take the play calling duties away from you so you can at least just focus on being the head coach moving forward, and you don't have to worry about the responsibilities that come along with calling the plays.
I completely agree with that. There's probably enough evidence to suggest that otherwise throughout the course of the season, but to me this was completely egregious. And on top of that, and I wrote a column earlier in the week, it's not the first time it's happened, something similar to that. And that's disturbing, right? I talk about if you're the Haslams, and I keep saying the Haslams, they're not the only ones making the decision, but they make the final decision. You have to be convinced that Freddie Kitchens will learn from all these mistakes, right? To me, that's the only thing that matters. Do you believe he is smart enough, open-minded enough, not too stubborn, to learn from the multitude of mistakes this year? And if you don't believe that, if you have doubt about that, then you have to move on. But, I mean, that's a question that they need to answer, in my opinion. And having said that, you point to the the debacle at the end of this half. I thought it was similar to how the half ended against Seattle. Freddie got real aggressive, said he was trying to score twice within the last couple of minutes of the first half, and wound up giving up a touchdown to Seattle that changed the game and changed the momentum of that game. So has he learned? He's still too aggressive, in my opinion, and I kind of like that aspect. You say, "Oh, my coach is aggressive," but I think he's been too aggressive, and I think that was obvious at the end of both those halves. And we're talking that I think Seattle was week 6, so 10 weeks later, it feels like the same type of mistake, and I think that is concerning. And it would bother me if I were the owners. Is he not learning? And if he's not learning, then either he's not the right guy for the job, or at the least, you have to take something off his plate.
Sure, and that's a humbling experience, too, when you're given the keys to the Ferrari and they take those keys away, right? You're not calling the plays, yet you still retain your position. So it would be interesting to see how that scenario would unfold. And, Scott, one of the other things that gets brought to the table, too, is the idea that the culture certainly hasn't turned into anything friendly or what the Browns thought they were going to have with all these different personalities in the locker room. And I've heard this talked about throughout the course of the week, people saying, it's frustrating when the team loses. It's even more frustrating and still somewhat puzzling when you see players take to Twitter immediately following a loss. Now, I'm not so sure if that's just a Browns thing or if that's an NFL culture thing at this point, but if you're a fan looking at that, that's got to be awfully concerning that a lot of these guys go right to social media immediately following a loss.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of times I got so much other stuff going on that I'm not necessarily paying a ton of attention to that. Obviously, the Jermaine Whitehead, when he went after the fans after that Denver loss was was over the top, and it got my attention immediately. But I think that's one of those things where, players, it's a couple of things. They have their antennae are always up, right? They're always hearing what people are saying, and social media magnifies that, and it gives them a voice, and they're hot and they're frustrated after the game, and they have an instant reaction. And then the other part of that is if they go on Twitter and just talk about non-football stuff, I think that bothers people because fans take these games so seriously, right? And I think you can even make an argument it means more to the fans. And not, I think in a big picture sense it doesn't, right? These players devote their lives to it. But the players also have to be able to move on, right? The game's over. They can't do anything about it. There's another game to get ready for. You have a family, all those things. And yes, the loss bothers them, but you have to learn to cope with it. While the fans, they seem to hang on to it longer, and I don't know if that's healthy or not, but it's just kind of the way it is. And I know that bothers fans, right? When they see players, the jersey exchange kind of thing. I know that bothers players, and that's just the way the NFL works these days. You're like, man, I hate that guy as a fan. How can you exchange jerseys with them? And, that's just the way of the world now, and it's a business for these guys, and it's their job. And, we could talk for hours about this, but I get your point. I think the fact that these players go on social media so close to the finish of the game doesn't always sit well with fans, and I get that.
Yeah, and again, I think that's kind of become more of an NFL culture type thing. It's not just a Browns thing. Yeah, it's something that happens all throughout the NFL. But sure, from a fan's perspective, you see that and think to yourself, interesting. Right away after a loss, they go right to social media and do whatever it is that they do. Well, speaking of social media, Scott, I'm sure that's going to be an awfully popular place here over the next 4 or 5 days. I think a lot of people really interested to see what happens at the end of Sunday's game in Cincinnati, a game the Browns are expected to win. But the ultimate question becomes, will that be enough for the entire coaching staff to come back? And then you start talking about what areas will the Browns immediately need to address at the end of the season. So sometimes, Scott, it feels like week one was just yesterday, and sometimes it feels like week one was 15 years ago. I mean, this has been a weird season.
There's no doubt about that. And I think the season finale should not weigh too heavily into whether or not Freddie Kitchens returns. I mean, if you beat Cincinnati, you're supposed to beat Cincinnati. If you lose to Cincinnati, does it really matter, 6-10 versus 7-9? I mean, if the Browns came out and were totally uninterested and Freddie had a horrible game as a play caller and decision maker, yes, that would factor in. But I think it's all the other things you have to weigh if you're making that decision about his future. Having said that, Cincinnati locked up the number one draft pick, so they're free to win the game. Not that they weren't trying to win, but you know how it is. Their fans are free to root for them to win because they've locked up that first pick. We'll probably take Joe Burrow, the quarterback. It'll be interesting. It's going to be interesting because this is the first game of the year where the playoffs aren't a possibility. The Browns players clung to the tiniest hope even going into last week. So, these guys talk about playing hard and being professionals, and that will be tested Sunday. I think you want to see Baker play well to finish his year. See Odell Beckham Jr. finish out the season with that sports hernia. I think it says something about him as a person, as a player, that it looks like he will finish all 16 games. I think that's important. But yeah, it's going to be a weird vibe because everybody is going to be focused on the future of Freddie Kitchens. And as of now, and maybe even after the game Sunday, I'm not sure we're going to have clarity on that.
Well, it'll give us a lot to talk about next week, that's for sure, when the season has officially come to a close. And at that point, well, hopefully there will be at least a little bit of clarity on who the head coach of the Browns will be in 2020. Scott, a pleasure as always. Thank you as always for the time. Always a lot of fun to do these BrownsZone.com zone coverage podcasts. You and I are far from the finish line, even though next week the season will be over. There will be plenty to talk about in the weeks to come.
No doubt about it. Thanks a lot, Andy.
Thank you, Scott. Again, Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and, of course, BrownsZone.com. That's going to wrap things up on today's edition of the BrownsZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Barch saying thank you so much for tuning in. Have a happy, healthy New Year, and we'll talk to all of you again next week.